Thanks for joining us today. I'm Josh Barnes, and this is Point of View. And this is the Spotlight Show where we put the spotlight on one special guest, and today's guest is going to knock your socks off. It's Dr. Erwin Lutzer, who is a preacher, former pastor of the Moody Church in Chicago, and author of the book, We Will Not Be Silenced. And I encourage you guys to get his book. He's an amazing guy. I had the highest respect for him before he ever came on the show. And I sat down with him just a few minutes ago and gonna play the interview for you now here on the show today. But before we get started, gotta remind you guys, please help support Point of View and shows like this on Right America Media by purchasing My Pillows on mypillow.com, and you can use the promo code RAM, get a bunch of different discounts on all the My Pillow items, and you not only get discounts, but you also help support shows like this on Right America Media. And we also have White Mountain Munchies. White Mountain Munchies are amazing, non-GMO, healthy food for on the go. They are, it's trail mix, but it's healthy. And it tastes amazing. You can get White Mountain Munchies at whitemountainmunchies.com and use the promo code RAM, RAM, at checkout to get a discount and to support Right America Media and shows like Point of View. So it's a win-win-win-win-win, no matter how you look at it. Everybody's happy when the day's through. Appreciate you guys supporting the show. And without further ado, let's go to the interview that I had with Dr. Erwin Lutzer. And I'm joined now by Pastor Erwin Lutzer, who is the pastor emeritus of the Moody Church in Chicago. He's an award-winning author, and his latest book has sold over 135,000 copies. And after today, it's actually 135,001 because I purchased the book and have been listening to the audio version. The book's named We Will Not Be Silenced, Responding Courageously to Our Culture's Assault on Christianity. And Pastor Lutzer, Dr. Lutzer, I should say, it is an incredible honor. When I was a teenager, I remember listening to you on the radio, and I've just always loved the content that you've put out, the books that you've authored, the sermons that I've heard. Thank you so much for joining Point of View today.
I'm so glad to be with you today, Josh. And as you've already hinted, we have some very important things to talk about today. We're going to be talking about the culture and the Christian response. So really privileged to have this interaction with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. What I loved, and we do a lot of books here on Point of View, and I've read several from many authors, and many times I have the frustrating job of promoting a book that I have to be honest with the viewers that I just disagree with. But they're welcome to buy and disagree with it along with me. But in this case, I think this book is so helpful. And one of the things we try to do at Point of View is really stop and think through issues. And I love how you've presented this in a very, how shall I say it? You've presented it in a very nonpartisan way. Though I think the conclusions you come to, many would say are partisan conclusions, but they aren't. You didn't come to those conclusions for partisan politics. And so we'll walk through a few of the issues that you talk about in the book, but I wanted to start with that title, which I think is grabbing and gripping, and it is "We Will Not Be Silenced." Is it your position? Do you believe that the Christian people, the Christian churches in this country, are being silenced right now?
Well, yeah, we're being shamed into silence, Josh, and it's happening in two ways. It's happening through the culture and the cultural pressure, but it's also happening legally and some of the things that are taking place. And the reason that I wrote this book is because I began to realize, Josh, that the radical left in America does not believe that America can be fixed. It has to be destroyed and rebuilt on a Marxist foundation, cultural Marxism, as opposed to classical Marxism. And once you do that, then of course, everything that we see happening in our culture begins to make sense. For example, one of the things that has to be done is our history has to be trashed in order to build a brand new future. So, every regime does that. I'm old enough to know when, the city of St. Petersburg was called Leningrad and then Stalingrad. So everybody wants to build their own future, but they have to discredit the past. And that's what's being done today under the guise of racism. So what I show is how that is being applied with a view to finally being rid of white supremacy and income inequality and all of the other things that are happening. Then very quickly, I also apply it to race, critical race theory, and show how that's being worked out and accepted, sometimes even in evangelical circles, and then to freedom of speech. And why is it that oftentimes conservatives are silenced at our universities? So I deal with all those things. And one of the most important chapters, I know you're listening to the book, I don't know if you got that far yet, is on propaganda. How does it work? And then I talk about the destruction of the family, the sexualization of children, socialism, and all these other issues. But the important thing to me as a pastor is I always end each chapter with asking this question: what should the response of the church be? Because after all, it isn't important for us to simply analyze the culture unless we speak to the culture and we speak to those who are going through very difficult circumstances, trying to navigate their faith in the midst of a culture that is beginning to close in on us. And Josh, it's to the point where there is no place for us to hide.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to get to that what you mentioned about this freedom of speech, and then we'll get to some of the other issues, because this is something that's on a lot of people's minds right now. We've got in Canada, we now have two pastors, Pastor Artur Pawlowski and Pastor James Coates, who've been arrested for meeting. And we've just been through an entire year of dealing with COVID, and certainly, I would say it's a serious concern, but also there's that concern that the government is in areas encroaching on our liberty and our freedom of speech and our right to assemble. Do you think that this plays into that, trying to silence the church, or would you separate that and say that's a separate issue?
No, I don't think so. And of course, you've been implying in your question that one of the issues has to do with COVID, the wearing of masks, the overreach of the government. We know that that certainly is happening because there's a lot of irrationality out there in terms of guidelines. But here's the point I want to make. A moment ago, I talked about cultural Marxism and how it applies now, since this is the question that you asked me. How does it apply to freedom of speech? Well, the answer is this. Marx believed, and his followers have believed, that if we allow freedom of speech, the capitalists would always win. Remember, the capitalists are the enemy. And so the only way socialism can win, that is to say Marxism, is if the capitalists keep their mouth shut, and finally the oppressors have the opportunity to speak. Because remember, as far as Marx was concerned, oppression was the key to history. So what he did is he applied it, and it's being applied today, as I show in the book, to race. And the whole idea is that there are two categories. There are the oppressed and there are the oppressors. And the oppressed have to overcome the oppressors. And the only way that can happen is if the oppressors keep their mouths shut. And that's why today in the universities, oftentimes what you find is conservatives are not allowed to speak, because after all, it is time for the oppressed to speak, namely the LGBT community and the minorities and so forth. So that's how cultural Marxism is applied to freedom of speech. And by the way, this is just thrown in, all of this business of not knowing what pronoun to use and the absurdities that we are involved in today, all of that also intimidates us, Josh. And we're afraid to speak because we might use the wrong pronoun and be called racist. And so George Orwell showed this, that you throw all that out there, you bring confusion to the culture, and then people will finally be silent. Now in the book, and I want to just tease this out a little further regarding freedom of speech, I have that chapter on how propaganda works. Remember that propaganda, the purpose of propaganda is to so shape people's view of reality that even when confronted with a mountain of evidence, they will not change their minds. And so what you do is you use fear, you use slogans, you use cultural, I should say, collective demonization, which we see. Somebody is deplatformed. Why everybody else chimes in to show that they are woke too. You know, this was perfected in Russia, where if the state called somebody a dissenter, then everybody else chimed in and they vilified the person too, even if they'd never heard of him before. Same thing happened in Nazi Germany. There were churches that put up swastikas on their doors saying, when you come for the Christians, don't come for us because we are on your side. So what you do is you use fear, you use intimidation, and of course you need a group to hate. You'll always need that if you are going to be able to grasp for power. And then you use slogans, pretending that you're saying one thing when in point of fact you're saying another. For example, I'm going to use Hitler once again, and then I'm going to let you ask the next question. But Hitler, when he starved children, called it putting them on a low-calorie diet. So you hide your true intentions, and in hiding your true intentions, you try to manipulate language so that you can justify what it is that you are doing. So propaganda has streams, and woe to the person who stands against it. So what people are asking today, Josh, is this: am I woke enough to be seen as virtuous? Because I have to join the woke movement so that I myself am not accused of all the sins that I'm accusing other people of. So all that is connected together.
Yeah, and I really do enjoy how in the book you bring in all of these historical figures who have written about exactly what America is going through. Karl Marx, Saul Alinsky. These are, I mean, they basically wrote the plan that's being carried out in America today, and we're seeing it unfold before our eyes. And it was eye-opening for me to see some of the stuff that you presented there. For those who are just joining us, the book is We Will Not Be Silenced by Dr. Erwin Lutzer, and we're joined today by Dr. Erwin Lutzer. And I guess one of my questions for you would be, do you think that this is an assault specifically more on capitalism, or is there a specific aim, that's more maybe demonic in nature, that's really just aimed at Christianity and Christ himself?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, it could be both. It could be both, but it's not just an assault on capitalism. It is the promotion of socialism so that we have equity, so that we have supposed equality, so that the word equality, and by the way, that was a key word in Marxism, was we want equality, the equality of women with men. And that's why Marx and other communists always wanted to see the dissolution of the nuclear family, because to them it was a unit of oppression. Men oppressed their wives, parents oppressed their children, took them to church. God was the ultimate oppressor. So as far as Marx was concerned, get rid of the oppression and people will even live wondrously without laws. So that also is connected to the whole socialistic ideal, where people think to themselves, if we just pooled all of our resources and if the state took care of us, why then indeed we would all finally be equal. And that has huge problems. One of the longest chapters in my book has to do with socialism. So I think it's socialism. It is the promotion of the destruction of the family. By the way, Josh, Black Lives Matter. Do Black Lives Matter? Of course, all Black Lives Matter. But isn't it interesting that on their website, they say that they believe in the dissolution of the nuclear family because they're basically Marxist. So here's the point that I want to make in answer to your question. All of this added together is connected, but to your point specifically, of course, You know, the Bible does say that the whole world lies in the lap of the evil one, so to speak. So if I might say, this capitalism, though the church can exist without capitalism, it's had to do that for hundreds of years. But if I might put in a word for capitalism, it has allowed us to make so much wealth that we can bless other countries. You can go around the world and see Christian ministries. And when you see them, what do you see? They are funded by American dollars. Americans give $400 billion a year to charity. So the point to be made is that all these things, though, are connected. And we're living at a time when there is this emphasis on globalism, a socialistic Marxist world, a world without borders, and we're already beginning to see that on our southern border, so that finally everyone can be equal. And I point out in the book how the word equality is misused. We have marriage equality, we have income equality, we have reproductive equality, which of course is abortion, and on and on. And so equality becomes this nice word that is pressed into service for some very nefarious agendas.
Yeah. So what about the Christian who says, all right, well, if I don't stand for if I don't stand for the family, if I don't stand for these things, will I be left alone? Is it possible to stand for Christ and not stand for the capitalist mentality in government? Is it possible to be a true Christian and avoid the attack that's coming?
Well, I really don't think so. Of course, it depends what your vocation is in. You know, the mother who's staying home with her children, and we just had Mother's Day and learned that some people think it should be People's Birthing Day because, after all, men can give birth to babies too. Josh, we're living at a time when absurdity no longer is an argument against anything. We must understand that, because the ideology trumps all reason, trumps biology, and all the rest. But in answer to the question that you have asked, we are indeed living at a time when, so for one person, you know, they may be able to get by being silent, but very few in our vocations will be allowed to be silent. Two illustrations come quickly to mind. Somebody who teaches here in the school system in Chicago told me that he was told, it is not enough for you to simply tolerate same-sex marriage. If you don't celebrate it, you could lose your job. Well, is he going to celebrate what God condemned? Of course not. So the question is the church going to come around him and support him during this time of trial? There are many instances like that. You know, will a business person be willing to write a letter of apology because they were born white? Can they do that with all honesty? So, you know, there are all kinds of things, and there are even now, of course, lawsuits regarding the intrusion of the government into Christian organizations. Yeah. That may be a separate topic, but I think that as this culture closes in on us, there will be no place to hide. And I think that it's coming down to that. So in answer to your question, I think it's very difficult for most Christians in America to simply avoid the fight without denying the faith.
Now, I ask that because, and I agree with you, but I ask it because I wonder if you feel that maybe our silence up until now, the silence of I suppose it's an assumption for me to say this, but perhaps there has been a silence among the majority of Christians, and that maybe has contributed to the place that we're at today. Would you say that that's true?
You know, as a pastor, Josh, I've had to wrestle with this, as every pastor does, because we want to be known as a loving congregation. Mm-hmm. So the question is, if we comment on these things, we won't be seen as loving. And so oftentimes pastors hide behind love and say, well, I'm just being loving. I don't want to speak against the LGBTQ community because that would be a stumbling block to them, and we want to reach them and we want to be loving. So what we have to do is to have a balance here. I point out in the book that love often is evil. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, they didn't stop loving. They just started to love the wrong things, lovers of pleasure, lovers of self, lovers of evil. So it's possible to love that which God has condemned. So the Christian church, in an attempt to be loving, has often been silent instead of speaking. On the other hand, we don't want to just be out there shouting and see who can shout the loudest. We should speak, but we should speak with humility and brokenness, with a welcoming spirit, always leading with the good news of the redemption in Jesus Christ. But speak we must if we're to be faithful to God.
Amen. That's good. So in the short time that we have left, can we do a few just a lightning round issues, I guess, and it doesn't have to be too fast, but what I noticed that you spend a good deal of the book on the social justice concept and critical race theory. How do you've sort of alluded to this already in some of your comments so far on the show, but what would you say is the tie between critical race theory and Marxism, and how do we skirt this as Christians, skirt the issue? Because we're not racist. Racism is a sin. It's wrong. It's not biblical in any way. But at the same time, we don't feel like CRT is the answer.
Josh, the good news is we don't skirt the issues. We are the answer to the issues. Critical race theory is based on the idea that you have the oppressed and the oppressors, and everybody fits into that category. So if you are white, you're an oppressor, and you're a person of privilege, even if you were born into the poorest home imaginable. But it's the skin color that really matters. And if you are not white, then of course you are oppressed. And so you're in that category. And the whole purpose, by the way, of all of these diversity studies in university, as I show, is to perpetuate conflict between the races, so that we are shouting at one another and blaming one another and all that. Now, how does Christianity have the answer? Christianity says there isn't that much distinction between us. We are all sinners. We are all created in the image of God with equal value before God. We're created in his image. We come to the foot of the cross. We receive forgiveness. And then we ask ourselves the question, what can we do together to make things better? To put it very succinctly, Christianity teaches we really don't have a skin problem, we have a sin problem. And that's why Christianity has the answer. There's so much more I could say about this. Paul in Colossians, for example, talks about in Jesus Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, Scythian, barbarian, bond or free. And so we're united in Christ. In other words, to put it very clearly, critical race theory keeps tearing apart what Jesus died to bring together.
Wow. Well, that's a great way to put it. Here's another question. I've got two more if you've got time for it. And that is, how does this apply? How does the concepts that's in your book, We Will Not Be Silenced, how do we apply these to things like transgender? Because this is, in my opinion, this is like the ultimate breakdown of the family structure. Now you don't just have two dads or two moms. You have a mom who thinks she's a dad, or so on and so forth. We even have Caitlyn Jenner now running for office in California, and all of this that's going on. What's going on here? How would you approach that from a Christian worldview?
Both the Bible and biology show that we are either born male or female. And so what we have to understand is in our society today, there are many people who are confused on this point, and Caitlyn Jenner would be an example. And, he, of course, transitioned, but there are many people who transition who not only regret it, but find out that the peace that they are seeking for simply does not work. And it doesn't work because they are really out of sync with who God created them to be. Now, if your teenager comes and says, I think I'm a girl, and he's actually born a boy, you have to listen to him. You have to try to understand his viewpoint, but at the same time, he has to be cautioned. He has to be warned that it would even be better to live single with these struggles than to transition over to something that you would regret and something that God did not make you to be. That's the price of following Jesus. But the idea that you can have surgery even for young children that are going to be altering their bodies to somehow fit who they think they are inside is a terrible disgrace. It turns out to be actually child abuse. If the body is mutilated to fit what's inside, what's wrong with suggesting that what's inside has to fit with the body that God gave you? This is the total destruction of the family. Marx would applaud, at last, there's equality. Namely, men can give birth to babies. And of course, all of this is really a deep rebellion against God. So we must be compassionate, but at the same time, there's plenty of evidence by biologists that the DNA and who God created us to be stays in place. And we need to emphasize that and not get off and confuse our young people.
Yes, yes, so good. One of the things you said really leads into my last question, and you mentioned how we have to listen to Caitlyn Jenner, and I think this may be one of the big things that's missing in America, and that is listening to each other and actually thinking through arguments from the other side, carefully weighing things, using critical thinking skills to approach an argument rather than just flying off the handle in fits of passion. What would you say is, would you say that, I mean, would you agree with that, I suppose, is my first question. And then to follow that up, do you think that's even more important as Christians, that we ought to be very careful, measured, thoughtful? And what would be the result if that was the case?
Yes, as I already implied earlier, when shouted at, don't shout back. Talk, but don't shout. Listen carefully. People don't respond to truth as quickly as they should. None of us really does, until they are really heard and we connect with them even at the emotional level. Churchill made the statement, which I also quote in the book, that the desire to believe something is much stronger than rational argument. So what we have to do is to win the hearts of people through our compassion, through our listening, and be welcoming even when we cannot be affirming, and help them to see that that actually is the best way for us to love them. So, the world out there are examples, of course, of very harsh and uncaring Christians shouting judgment. That's not our role. Our role is to listen, to be compassionate, to speak, and to say to people that we have a Savior who says, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." That there is a rest in Jesus for everyone if they're willing to receive it.
Amen. Well, Pastor Lutzer, Dr. Lutzer, Dr. Pastor Lutzer, thank you so much for joining us on Point of View today. His book is We Will Not Be Silenced: Responding Courageously to Our Culture's Assault on Christianity. And it can be found anywhere, right? Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
And also christianbook.com, any one of the places where books are sold.
Or if you do a lot of driving like me, you can get it on Audible and listen to it as well. There's many, many different ways to do it. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll definitely have you back on another date.
Thanks, Josh. God bless.
What a great man. I had so much fun chatting with Dr. Lutzer earlier today, and I am just overjoyed to have been able to purchase his book, read it. I really, really do think this book is right up your alley. If you like point of view, if you like critical thinking and thinking thoughtfully and carefully about issues, then you will absolutely love We Will Not Be Silenced by Dr. Erwin Lutzer. Go check it out. And let me know what you think. Put your comments in the comments below. Let me know what you think next week. We'll see you next time on Point of View.